Senator Nicole Matthews, and we're so pleased to be with everybody. I'm calling to order this meeting of the task force, and I want to acknowledge the presence of our members here. On the House side, we're joined by Representative Patricia Mueller, Representative Krista Knudsen, Representative Jess Hansen is online, I know, along with Representative Hoden Hassan. I believe that that's it on the House side. And then the Senate side, we have Senator Cruen, Senator Housley, Senator Hoffman, Senator Champion, of course, my co-chair, and I believe and also Senator Matthews is joining us as well. So we have quite a full House in terms of attendance by members. Our first item of business is to approve our minutes from our last meeting. And so I want to get to that if we can. Folks should have a copy of that. Members should in your packets, and folks who are with us in the room, I believe there's copies as well, and for members of the public online. So if I can have a motion to approve our minutes from our last meeting. All right, Madam Co-Chair moves that. Any additions or corrections or discussion to the minutes, members? So not hearing any, all in favor of approval of our minutes for a meeting of December 4th, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, those minutes are approved. That motion does pass. At our last meeting, we had introductions from members, and I actually do want to, we were joined by one new member. I think everybody else got the chance to speak, to introduce themselves last time, but I know that Representative Knudsen is newly appointed, and so Representative Knudsen, if you just want to say where you're from and sort of what brings you to this work briefly, we'd appreciate that.
Sure.
Please.
Thank you, Chair. Representative Krista Knudsen, I'm from District 5A, which is up north, and recently appointed. I have a background in social work and alcohol and drug counseling, so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'm just going to see whether there's any members who didn't. Senator Champion, please introduce yourself. So glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And to the audience, I am Senator Bobby Joe Champion. I represent Senate District 59, which is the best Senate district ever. But I just want to make sure that everyone knows that. And I am excited to be here in order to participate in a meaningful way. And thank you for all the work that has been done even before today. And I look forward to hearing the testimony. And it's good to see some others, like Thomas Berry and others here in order to speak to this critical issue. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Champion. And so members of the public and members, and we just approved the minutes for this, at our last meeting that Senator Mitchell called, and thank you so much for doing that. We received a number of perspectives on the child protection issues in our state, and we want to continue that. I'm just giving a little preview for our agenda for this afternoon. Continuing that in our first segment, you'll see some additional perspectives on the child protection system. I'll note that these are necessarily, we have a number of people speaking, but of course only a small slice of the folks who could speak to these issues. What I've asked as chair in pulling this together is just for folks to provide just a few minutes about what are some things that you would want legislators to be thinking about as they think about our child protection system and think about reforms and think about what's working well and what's not working so well. That's the first segment of our agenda. The second segment is going to be to hear from some experts on how child welfare systems are working around the country in their operations and their financing and especially their structure. We're unusual in having, it's not so common among states that we have a county administered system, and to hear about the strengths and weaknesses of that as compared to other systems and those sorts of details, that has come up as a topic and seems like it's really useful for us to hear about the research and practice relating to that. And the final two pieces are going to be to hear about a couple of ideas, and I think we're going to be hearing more about these, more about ideas in the coming months, and certainly as we head into session. But one regarding training of mandated reporters that comes a little bit out of the Office of Legislative Auditor report we heard at our last meeting that Chair Mitchell will be talking about. And then consideration of a statewide maltreatment reporting system that comes a little bit out of a recommendation from the 2015 task force report. And Representative Hicks will be sharing a few thoughts on that at the end. So that's the plan in terms of the agenda. I'm going to see if there are questions on that. I'm going to turn to my co-chair, see if she has anything to say, and then we'll dive in. So seeing hands on that. And so, Madam Co-Chair, anything that you wish to say at this time?
Nothing. I'm anxious to dive right in. I would like to say thank you for everyone who was here last time, who was here this time, and I'm sure we all have, but I know I certainly have had a number of members from various aspects of the community reach out have input in this process, some people with some really wonderful experiences to share. And so thank you to everyone who continues to do that, because we want to have the best quality of information as we make these decisions. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the reminder of that. And I too have received a lot of information. I think members of the task force have as well. If I've received something, I've tried to get it out, and I think that Chair Mitchell has as well, to members of the task force. And I think at the last meeting, I had said both the end and the beginning, really encouraging folks to keep that up and to be coming forward with your ideas, both in general, but then certainly shaping them into bills, and would encourage people to continue to do that with those of us on the task force, with your own legislators. This is such an important issue, and we're grateful to folks with us in person and online as well. So with that, we're going to dive into, not seeing any other hands or anything, dive into our first substantive topic. I'm going to ask up Misty Kuntz, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, to come on up. You come up to the microphone. Oh, yeah. And I want to just note, I'm asking folks, you can just get yourself settled in, asking folks to take, I think we've said 5 minutes apiece, which both adds up, but also I know is not long at all per person, and my apologies for that. We'll be a little bit loose on that if you go a little bit beyond 5, but kind of at about the six minute mark, I'm planning to cut you off. And if we can have, after that, Ariana Guerra, perhaps even have you be ready to come on up to be going next, so we'll just go right through in the order. So, and I want to note before we have quite a few ombudspersons, just so folks are aware that one definition of an ombudsperson, because I was not as familiar with this, is an independent, impartial public official with authority and responsibility to look into government actions and make findings and recommendations regarding a given topic. So we have our first ombudsperson here, and so if you could please introduce yourself for the record, and then please proceed with your testimony. And thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chair Pinto and members. For the record, my name is Misty Kuntz. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the ombudsperson for foster youth for the state of Minnesota. For those who are not aware, the Office of Ombudsperson for Foster Youth was created through legislation in the 2022 session based on advocacy and testimony by current and former fosters. These fosters were seeking a mechanism for more oversight and accountability based on their experiences of abuse, neglect, discrimination, or exploitation at the hands of our very own child protection systems. I'm very grateful for the fosters who bravely shared their personal testimony, and for the authors, lawmakers, and other advocates who supported the bill's passing. For clarity, my use of the term fosters in my comments today is in line with the description provided by foster advocates. They describe that early leaders in their network stated that foster care creates a significant cultural identity akin to other immutable characteristics that goes unrecognized once they are reunited with family, adopted, or if they age out. In response, they use the term foster to name and claim this unique identity. I was appointed by Governor Walz in September of 2023 and started in my role at the end of October. The advisory board for this office was appointed on November 1st, which consists of 15 total members, 9 of which include positions for people who have direct lived experience in foster care. Several other of our advisory board members also bring direct lived experience in foster care, in addition to their professional roles in working with fosters. I also bring my own lived experience in foster care to this role, combined with professional experience as a social worker here in Minnesota for the past 14 years. As stated in the enabling legislation for this office, the foster youth ombudsperson is accountable to the governor and may investigate decisions, acts, and other matters related to the health, safety, and welfare of youth in foster care to promote the highest attainable standards of competence, efficiency, and justice for youth who are in the care of the state. These requirements and goals are closely aligned with the goal of this task force, as Madam Co-Chair Mitchell expressed last month, the importance of a child-centric focus and to better serve the children of Minnesota. In order to do this, we need to ensure that our state's decision makers are intentionally seeking input, including complaints and concerns from fosters about our experiences. And then when warranted, to make improvements based on the things that we are hearing, seeing, and learning from fosters. We believe that feedback, including complaints and ideas for solutions that are shared with our government from or about the services we provide to residents of Minnesota, are a gift. We see this feedback can help us to learn and grow so that we can do more of what's working and then to shift the things that aren't. Feedback like this and being responsive to it leads to increased trust in our government. This is why I and many, many others are excited about having this Ombuds for Foster Youth that focuses specifically on hearing from fosters, the very people our child welfare system aims to serve. I'm working diligently to set up the operations and infrastructure of the Office of Ombudsperson for Foster Youth, and then I will embark on outreach to ensure that current foster youth and the many people who have concerns on their behalf know about this office, what to expect from us, and how they can contact us. We have a goal of opening the office by April of this year to receive complaints, questions, and concerns from and on behalf of fosters, and to seek appropriate resolution through a credible review process. As you can see, our office is still in its infancy. However, we already have a number of issues that have been identified from fosters through their testimony in support of the creation of this office, through stories and data shared by our advisory board members with me, and from public data regarding our state's concerning racial disparities for African American and Indigenous children and families. These include such things as lacking support for pregnant and parenting fosters, disconnection between siblings who aren't living together in one home, and a general but very concerning lack of understanding about which rights and resources are available for foster youth. And young adults in foster care. And these are just to name a few of the things that have been brought to our attention. I have heard from and about many fosters who were not aware of their option to remain in extended foster care or about benefits available to them to help them access higher education. I've heard from other fosters who opted into extended foster care and attended college with the supports available through existing programs.
You got just under a minute left, just to say.
Thank you. However, they did not know that they had the benefit of continued health insurance and thus put off necessary health care due to concerns of the costs. We know that the list of things that we can work on in order to improve the experiences of fosters in Minnesota is long, it's complex, and that the issues disproportionately impact marginalized communities who are often unheard or less heard. The Office of Ombudsperson for Foster Youth looks forward to hearing from fosters and from others who have concerns or questions on their behalf once our office is up and running in a few months. We intend to uphold the standards defined by the United States Ombuds Association in our investigations, which includes independence, impartiality, confidentiality, and a credible review process. And then we look forward to collecting, analyzing, and reporting on data regarding the health, safety, and well-being of youth in foster care to inform our recommendations for improvement.
Going to have to cut you off, I'm afraid.
Okay.
If you can just wrap up, yeah. Thank you so much, though, for being with us, especially in the early days of your role. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if we can have Ariana Guerra come up. And then Ann Hill is joining us online. And so after Ms. Guerra is done, then we're going to turn to Ann Hill. And so if you can please, once you get settled in, identify yourself for the record. Share your preferred pronouns if you're comfortable with that, and then please proceed.
Thank you, Chair Pinto and members. Good afternoon. My name is Ariana Guerra, she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Systems Change at Foster Advocates. We are an organization directed by and for fosters working to improve the foster care space in Minnesota. I would like to thank you for the invitation to speak before you today and share our perspective on the child protection system and on the issues we feel are important to highlight as we all move forward this upcoming legislative session. In our work with fosters and in many of our own personal experiences, we have seen the harms that our fosters and their families face at the hands of our child welfare system. I want to start today by sharing with you some quick data points that are reflective of young people who were at some point under the custody of our child protection system. 37% of fosters graduated from high school in the traditional 4 years. Only 3% of fosters will successfully obtain a 4-year college degree. 41% of fosters do not have stable housing upon reaching adulthood, making them the most predictable population to become homeless. And by age 17, 51% of fosters will have an encounter with the juvenile justice system. Whether you are hearing these for the first time or not, this is the reality and outcome of our current statutes, policies, and procedures. This is an important picture and a direct reflection of our investment in young people and families. We have to ask ourselves, are we okay with this? We appreciate the momentum and awareness that has come from the Star Tribune investigation into the widespread failures in our system. We also appreciate the commitment and impending investment that may come this upcoming legislative session. And at the same time, we are disheartened at the immediate reaction to invest more money, power, and energy into a system where no accountability exists. For decades, stakeholders have advocated for more reforms, more funding, more training, and adding more social workers to our workforce. But what will change if there are no services to refer our families to, and wait lists are still months out? There are no placements for fosters, and there are no concrete supports that are even accessible. For example, we know the majority of cases that are screened in are due to the effects of poverty. So this allocation of funding simply doesn't address the shortage of accessible housing, access to childcare, substance abuse treatment, and mental health services. This is what families are asking for. This is what they need. Families in crisis simply cannot operate under the bureaucratic timelines in which counties in our state operate. It has not worked, and it will never work. This upcoming session, we are focused on prevention and investing directly in fosters and families. What would it look like if we started investing in people and truly gave them a hand up to grow and thrive? What does prevention in practice really look like? And we have already seen and supported some transformational and unique initiatives in the previous session, such as the Homeless Youth Direct Cash Pilot Project led by Rep. Kozlowski and Senator McEwen. When egregious harm happens, many of us are so quick to blame the system, social workers, and even the parents and families who we claim we are intervening to help. We all have a part to play in it. And many of us have heard others throw around phrases such as, the system is broken, there are cracks in the system, or the system is failing. At Foster Advocates, we disagree. We believe these are not system failures, but rather the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The harm to families by the state is not an unintended consequence. It is built into the foundations of the child welfare system. Governments were never intended to raise children. Therefore, they are not qualified to raise children. So why do we continue to prioritize our investment there? Is this really the only way? What if we turned our focus to addressing the root causes? What if we invested in the concrete and economic supports we know our families need and prevented a young person from entering foster care in the first place? Real services versus resources. Real capital versus lotteries for housing vouchers and wait lists. That is the difference. We must also begin recognizing the impact of generational trauma in all of this. We know many of the families we serve are stuck in the cycle of foster care. We often struggle to see that many of the parents we are so quick to judge were also once in our foster care system, and we failed them. It is important we find ways to invest not only in fosters when they are young, but when it may matter most, in their transition into adulthood and when they are starting families of their own. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we hope this perspective from fosters is helpful to you as you prioritize and decide on the changes that will hopefully improve outcomes for our children and families. Again, we appreciate your intentionality today, and we hope you will use this as a resource. We're happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thanks for that powerful testimony and for all your work for fosters. Thank you so much. And members, I do expect there'll be a bit of time at the end to ask questions of the folks who've testified. I'd like to get through all of them if we can. I'm thinking that's best, and then we can ask questions. So we've got Ann Hill online, and I saw Mira Gabasta coming up, and also Manuel Zuniga, so that's great. Ann Hill, you can please identify yourself for the record when you're ready, and please proceed.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
You know, it's a little tough. It's maybe get a little closer to the mic. We're working on volume, maybe.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
You know, it's kind of getting there. I'm going to look to my Senate colleagues, especially who are experts in this space, to.
Good afternoon, can you hear me now?
It's still not great. I'm looking to. So hold on a second. Let's see if we can. Any suggestions? And we're working on. Try it again, maybe.
Good afternoon, can you hear me now?
You know, it's getting better. Yeah, I think just if you can get real close to the microphone and speak pretty loudly, that'd be very helpful. Can't hear you. It's maybe even, you know, it's about the same, maybe slightly worse, but if you get nice and close and speak loudly.
Okay. Good afternoon to Chair Pinto, Representative Pinto, and members of the task force. My name is Ann Hill, and I'm with the Office of Ombudsperson for Families, and I am the Ombudsman for African American families. I'd like to thank you for your interest and care in Minnesota's most vulnerable children and families, and your commitment to exercise your authority and power to improve the lives of all Minnesota children and families by ensuring we are supporting the best practices and the best policies that can improve the lives of our children and families, and that we are, in fact, doing no more harm. I've had the privilege to work with many legislators, department heads, academic leaders, researchers, licensing boards, the courts, community members like Mr. Thomas Berry. Thank you for being there. And members for many years trying to get CPS services and child welfare services right. I've witnessed some of the benefit of our efforts. For instance, when I first started in this business, the number of children in out-of-home placement was about twice as much as it is right now. Although the disparities still exist, there has been some improvement in some areas. However, Minnesota is not off the hook. African American and other children of color fare poorly and often far behind white children when you compare the critical areas of child well-being. But for instance, education, health outcomes, graduation rates, incarceration rate, ACEs. We just don't get to say that Minnesota children are doing the best in the country. And I've heard this on numerous occasions without acknowledging how poorly African American children and others are doing in the state. In this state, we are where the senior population is outpacing our younger population. Every child must count, and every child must matter. We are obligated to afford every child the best possible outcome because Minnesota's future depends on us. Now, some areas that I think the task force should consider would be, some of you may know that the Children's Bureau reported that African Americans' reentry to Minnesota's foster care system is well above the national performance. So currently, there is a collaboration between the Department of Human Services and the Minnesota Judicial Branch that is focusing on the high reentry rate of African American children into Minnesota's foster care system. This initiative is attempting to get a variety of perspectives on the root causes, the effectiveness of the interventions, and lessons learned via research and promising practices. It would be in this task force's interest to monitor the progress of this initiative. With respect to adoptions, these are some of the concerns that I've been getting over the last 18 months. We must improve our adoption efforts. This is a group of children, predominantly African American and other children of color. Many have experienced trauma during the critical years of their development. 51% of these children are 12 to 18 years old, so they're coming into the workforce. And then 21% of these children are children under the age of 6, really our most vulnerable population. We've got to change here, but we've got a challenge here, but we can and must do something about it. Treatment programs, again, an area that I continue to get a lot of concerns about. Why don't we follow the money here? Where are we what is it costing us? And really, is it really making a difference? We have to do better with the treatment programs that we're using. Relative caretakers, they continue to get calls from relatives. This is our most valuable placement placement service, relative placements in Minnesota. So we're oftentimes slow to respond to them, slow to pay them. And these caretakers, many elderly, many having health problems, have some of their own problems, have some of their own issues like poverty, safe housing, transportation issues, and so forth and so on. And they're many times unfamiliar with the rules and expectations of child welfare placing agencies. Now, in conclusion, I would say not only review Minnesota's child welfare structure, but how it's financed. We've got a problem here, and I think you all know it. We're not paying for these services, and Minnesota needs to invest in it. Let's follow the money. Are we getting the best return on our investment in Minnesota's child welfare system? Are we really keeping children safe? Are we really investing in the well-being of all children? It shouldn't be difficult for us to identify these areas in our state where we need a targeted investment. Where are those red zones? And why can't we invest in safe children's zones and save a community and improve the outcomes for every vulnerable and disenfranchised child in Minnesota? I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going to be real honest, I've worked in this area for a very long time. I'm exhausted, and it's time for us to stop admiring the problem and really do something about it. Thank you for your time, and I'll be more than pleased to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Hill. Maybe I'll note for members, my understanding is that folks, I hope this is true, that folks in the audience were perhaps able to hear that probably better than we could. So I'm glad you all could, and I think and we could as well.
I can send a copy.
Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, my committee administrator, I think, was going to contact you to get to get your remarks as well sent out to folks. But we also were able to hear, we just had to work a little bit and saw online as well. Thank you so much for that. And so moving to Miro Gubasta, I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, but please identify yourself and proceed as you're ready.
Buenas tardes. Yes, you did pronounce my surname correctly. It is Gubasta.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Pinto, and also thank you to Madam Co-Chair Mitchell. To follow up with a few things that our coworker and colleague Ann Hill had to say, just wanted to share a little bit of information about the Office of Ombudsperson for Families. It was created by the state legislature in 1991 to provide a fair, neutral, and transparent environment between state and county agencies and families of color in Minnesota. Our mission is to ensure that children and families are protected by law in all child placement proceedings conducted by public and private agencies and organizations. The Office of Ombudsperson for Families performs a unique role in government. While we receive complaints from the public who often feel they aren't being heard, our job is to remain a neutral investigator of facts. Our role is to make recommendations to county social services agencies on open CHIPS cases in order to correct wrongs done to individuals with the purpose of improving the administration of government in Minnesota's child welfare systems. Families who contact the Office of Ombudsperson for Families with an inquiry or complaint often feel their concerns have not been adequately addressed by the County Social Services Department responsible for their open child protection matter. Specifically, we concentrate on racial disparities in out-of-home placement. Minnesota fares poorly in comparison to other states. Racial disparity carries over into many areas of society and culture and may even determine which children are placed out of home, the accessibility and quality of services they receive, the urgency of delivery, and the evaluation of family case outcomes. A lack of culturally educated child welfare workers adds to cultural and linguistic challenges, and consideration for children's permanency, particularly for families and children of immigrants and refugees. The Office of Ombudsperson for Families receives a wide range of calls each year that include the following types of complaints. Children are not placed with their families or relatives. Relatives and families are not being considered for permanency placement. The social worker and/or guardian ad litem do not speak the parent's language, nor are interpreter services being provided. There's no transportation to parents' visitations. The case plan is completed, but the social service agency won't return the children. The parent can't get into treatment in a timely manner. There's inadequate housing. The social worker or supervisor will not return calls. Mistreatment of a child or children in foster homes. Failure to provide linguistically and culturally appropriate mental health services. These are just a few to mention. As our purpose is to ensure better outcomes for African American, Latino, Asian and Pacific Island children in the child protection system, the Office of Ombudsperson for Families implemented many initiatives and task forces that have had an ongoing and positive impact on eliminating racial disparities in child welfare and for improving outcomes for children and their families involved in child protection cases. Some of the initiatives that reflect how we utilize different strategies in our work include the African American Disparities Advisory Committee, Our Children, Our Future, the Ramsey County Ending Racial Disparities Task Force, the Minnesota Supreme Court Children's Justice Initiative. We've been involved with the CJI since 2006 to the present. Minnesota Department of Human Services Children's Justice Act Task Force, another task force we've been involved with since 2006 to the present. The Minnesota Child Welfare Training System Central Steering Committee, Ramsey County Citizen Advisory Panel, Hennepin County Child Protection Task Force, University of Minnesota Gamble-Skogmo Advisory Panel, Structured Decision-Making Policy and Procedures of Minnesota Department of Human Services, the Minnesota Department of Human Services Maltreatment Guidelines Committee, and the AARP Minnesota Pathways to Kinship Care. We will continue our ongoing work throughout the state by working closely with the Department of Human Services, the Minnesota courts, and other key stakeholders to develop policies and best practice standards that positively and directly impact communities of color and that improve the lives of all Minnesota families. Thank you for the opportunity to present before.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gabasta. And Mr. Zuniga, if you can please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, respected members of the Legislative Task Force on Child Protection, Mr. and Madam Chair. I'm Manuel Zuniga, he, him pronouns, Ombudsperson for Asian Pacific Families with Minnesota's Office of Ombudsperson for Families. The Office of Ombudsperson for Families is an independent state agency that does not fall under the Department of Human Services. There are 3 ombudspersons working with all Minnesotans and with lived experience, specialized lived experience with different communities of color. Each ombudsperson works independently from, but in collaboration with, each of the following groups: the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs, the Council of Minnesotans of African Heritage, and also the Council of Asian Pacific Minnesotans. The Office of Ombudsperson for Families was created in 1991 by the state legislature to provide a fair, neutral, and transparent environment between state and county agencies and families of color in Minnesota. OBFF is a wholly independent state agency whose goals are to reduce racial and ethnic disparities and disproportionality in Minnesota's child welfare system, to improve outcomes for children and their families involved in child protection cases, to ensure that all laws governing the protection of children and their families are implemented in a culturally and linguistically competent manner, and to ensure that the laws protecting children and families are adhered to in decision-making processes. The 3 OBFF ombudspersons independently are responsible for reviewing government and government-regulated agencies in an effort to ensure practices and policies are fair, reasonable, and culturally appropriate. The strategies OBFF employs in performing its mandate include investigation, making recommendations on cases regarding noncompliance with state or federal laws and policies, monitoring agency compliance with all laws governing child protection and placement that impact children of color, public policy development, working to effect policy changes when current policies do not reflect best practices, i.e. examples of some of the initiatives on which the ombudspersons have worked. We've worked, as Muriel had noted, the CGI, the Supreme Court Children's Justice Initiative, and also the Minnesota Department of Human Services Children's Justice Act Task Force. And as well as the Department of Human Services Cultural and Ethnic Communities Leadership Council. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take the opportunity today to broadly discuss the concept of government transparency regarding how Minnesota administers its child welfare system by using the example of the Department of Human Services Social Service Information System, or SSIS. SSIS is Minnesota's statewide automated child welfare information system that collects federally mandated child welfare data and provides support for the delivery and management of child welfare services. SSIS is a data entry and case management system used by over 10,000 state and county workers in a variety of human service program areas for all 87 counties and tribal nations. In a recent SNAP survey of members of the United States Ombudsman Association, of 18 other states that responded, Minnesota is the only state that at the state level does not provide direct access for ombudspersons to the state system for child welfare data to provide oversight. The issue of direct access is an issue that Minnesota's ombudspersons, including my respected colleague at the OOFY, Misty Kuntz, who spoke earlier, deem of the utmost importance to ensure that government transparency and safeguards to protect Minnesota's children and families are emphasized regarding a child-centered and community-focused response to child welfare. It is imperative to support these efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to address the task force today. I renew my dedication to our collective work, and I look forward to collaborating to support children and families in Minnesota achieve better outcomes in child protection cases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the testimony for both of you. Grateful for that. I'm going to ask Ms. O'Leary to come up and probably ask Ms. So please go back to your seats, and then we'll see if there's some questions. And I think, Ms. Esch, I'm going to ask you to come up as well, and then that way we'll kind of be ready to go with you and then the next testifier, and we'll just kind of go right from there. And so if you can please, now that you've settled in, please identify yourself, Ms. O'Leary, for the record, and proceed.
Thank you, Representative Pinto, Senator Mitchell, and the members of the task force. My name is Patrice O'Leary, and I am the Associate Vice President of Family Services at Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota, or LSS. We are a statewide nonprofit provider of services for people with disabilities, older adults, and children, youth, and families, including an LSS Kinship Family Support Services program, which provides education, information, and compassionate support for kinship caregivers. Thank you for the opportunity to uplift the needs of kinship caregivers who play a critical role in promoting family preservation, reducing trauma-related out-of-home placement, and preventing children from entering the child protection system. Kinship caregivers are relatives such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, etc., or close family friends who are raising children when parents cannot care for them. Children may be staying with the caregiver in informal care, or they may be in a foster care system placement, which we will term as formal foster care. When children cannot remain safely with their parents, prioritizing kinship care helps us to preserve cultural identity and connections to community, helps keep sibling groups together, and provides a greater sense of continuity and stability for children as they tend in kinship placements. They move less frequently than non-family foster care settings and have lower rates of re-abuse. They are less likely to experience school disruptions. They experience higher levels of permanency and have better behavioral and mental health outcomes. Additionally, kin placements help preserve a child's relationship to their birth parents and allow for easier facilitation of reunification when that's possible. A vast majority of kinship caregivers are caring for their kin informally or more fittingly in the invisible foster care system. According to Generations United, for every one child being raised by kin in foster care, 18 children are being raised by kin outside of foster care. Informal kinship care is a preventative measure from entering the child welfare system. However, less child welfare involvement means barriers to accessing the resources provided to families within the formal system. We must consider strategies to support families who currently fall outside of the reach of existing public programs and other financial supports. Yet there is a clear need to bolster programs that support and connect all kin families to resources in order to successfully support their stability. Caregivers must navigate complex systems, including the legal system, health care, public benefits, county administration, schools, and more. Assessing these supports is complicated and time-consuming, and at times not successful. Yet having responded in a moment of need, they often are consigned themselves, as well as the children in their care, to economic struggle and instability. Last session, we partnered with Aspire MN on House File 1661, Senate File 1639, to address this need, and plan to continue this work in the upcoming session. In conclusion, we recommend consideration of robust supports for kinship care, a critical prevention intervention within the child welfare system. We believe that this will make invisible foster care visible. When children are diverted from formal placement, they should not disappear unknown and unsupported. We recommend funding robust, sustainable kinship navigation programs with services that are accessible and locally available. These programs connect caregivers with necessary resources such as financial and legal assistance, housing, health services, and food and nutrition benefits to ensure better outcomes and stability. We encourage to consider strategies to support families who currently fall outside of the reach of public programs and other financial supports, as many are pushed beyond the financial reality they are prepared for. Kinship caregiving spans cultural, racial, and socioeconomic lines. It is time to properly build awareness of and invest in kinship caregiver services and support in a way that truly recognizes the positive role kinship families play in fostering safe and healthy development of children, preserving cultural traditions and values, and increasing the protective factors they offer by caring for children experiencing trauma. Thank you very much again for this opportunity. LSS is committed to the important work of building a foster care system that supports children and families. Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony and for your work. Appreciate it. I'm going to ask Joanne Hodgman to make your way forward as Ms. Esch identifies herself, and then please proceed with your testimony. Glad to have you here.
Aloha and good afternoon. My name is Jill K. Haulani Esch. I am the Ombudsperson with the Office of Ombudspersons for American Indian Families, the only independent state agency of its kind in the nation. I want to thank the legislators who supported that legislation back in 2021. As some of you know, Minnesota is #1 in the nation for the removal of American Indian children from their homes. Between 16 to 21 American Indian children are removed for every one white child. You have 2 white children in line who are being removed from a home. You have 16 American Indian children in the next line. Last year, MIFPA legislation was passed, and I'd like to thank everyone who supported that, and that was basically to codify the Indian Child Welfare Act. This session, more legislation is going to be introduced to further strengthen the Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act, such as not allowing foster care providers to intervene in the child protection proceedings so that the case does not become about the biological parents versus the foster parents. If foster parents are allowed to intervene and become a party, it affects the case significantly and goes against the Indian Child Welfare Act. Instead of parents spending the time to work their case plan to be reunified back with their children, they are fighting with the foster parents who decided that that is how the best way that they can get a child was to sign up to be foster parents and not to sign up to help to keep the children safe. Foster parents are temporary. They should not be parties to a case. Legislation is also going to be introduced for the Office of Ombudsperson for American Indian Families for waived filing fees. While I am a licensed attorney, I do not provide legal advice, but I provide information resources, such as writing letters to the court to shine a spotlight on what the letters are. It costs $500 for a filing fee. We need to get it waived so that our agency we do not have the funds for it. When this agency was created in 2021, it was only appropriate at $190,000 for this agency. So we will be doing that. I joined with the Office of Ombudspersons for Families and the Office of Ombudspersons for Foster Youth and others regarding getting access to the SSIS records. I co-chair the Children and Families chapter of the United States Ombuds Association, and Minnesota is one of the states that do not have direct access to that. In March of 2015, the Governor's Task Force on Protection of Children issued final report and recommendations. Recommendation number 80D said to require courts and social services to distribute information regarding the Ombuds Office in the following situations: in the early stages of a child protection investigation or assessment, social services, and when a child in need of protection or services petition is filed with the courts. It is really helpful that parents know that there are resources out there. When parents contact me, I can provide them with information and resources. And because the parents contacted me, sometimes cases do not end up in court because the parents have the information resources. So if the parents know about the Office of Ombudspersons for American Indian Families, we can go ahead and do that. Finally, the legislature can invest in facilities to further help families. There is no facility in Minnesota, excuse me, when a custodial father, he has custody of his child and he knows that he needs to go into treatment. There is no facility in Minnesota that will allow that father to take his child with him. There are facilities that will allow mothers to take their children with them, but there's no facility for fathers. Another facility, services for children who are on the run. When children are in foster care and they're on the run and they get picked up, they're taken to hospitals, and hospitals do not have the resources to keep the children there. They don't need to be treated them medically, but there is no place for that. So Minnesota needs to invest in the children. The children are our future. And I thank you very much for all of your help, and thank you for creating the Office of Ombudspersons for American Indian Families.
Ms. Esch, thank you for your testimony and for your work. I really appreciate it. As the next testifiers are getting ready to go, I'm going to ask Hailey Tageni to come on up and take a seat, but we've got these two testifiers, and so please, if you can identify yourselves and proceed.
Thomas Berry with Village Arms.
And Joanne Hodgman, also of Village Arms. And we are addressing the committee on behalf of Khalees Houston, who could not be present today. Child welfare disproportionality is a long-standing issue in the state of Minnesota, one that year after year legislators shrug their shoulders at when asked how to address it. Minnesota's African-American youth are removed from their homes at an alarming rate, and a large number are crossing over from the child protection system into the juvenile justice system. Racial disparities are found in the entire process, from initial reporting, screening, and the assessment to discharge from the system. The child protection reform that first began under the orders of Governor Dayton failed to address the disproportionality, unequal treatment, and poor child welfare outcomes for African-American children and their families. On the contrary, the governor's task force recommendations led to a 50% increase in the seizure of African-American children from their homes. Our fear is that you are prepared to do the same. The Star Tribune helped with this increase back in 2014 and recently released a series of similar articles. Propaganda that doesn't reflect the experience of the majority of the families wrongfully targeted by the family policing system. These articles focus on a very small percentage of the cases. In 2021, of the 10,000 plus children that were seized from their homes, only 6.9% were seized for physical abuse and 3% for sexual abuse. These articles and those like it are used to incite fear and foster care panic. They have already contributed to an increase in surveillance and unnecessary separation of Black families. They make the false claim that the family preservation and child safety are opposites, and they are not, and the false claim that the pendulum has swung too far towards keeping families together. They leave out the fact that from 1999 to 2021, Minnesota tears apart families at a rate vastly above the national average. These articles are dangerously misleading, expletive, and cannot be relied upon to guide efforts for reform. The horrible cases that are used as examples are able to occur partially because of the perpetual clogging of our child protection system with children that are not at risk of harm. These low to moderate cases are the majority and they're contributing to caseworker overload, a significant decrease in foster home availability, and a senseless increase in state spending while leaving children truly in need of protection vulnerable and at risk. These cases would be better served by family and community, not the government, who, especially when the child is Black, relies heavily upon child removals. Although this is not an evidence-based practice, in fact, the research and overall statistical outcomes for foster youth prove that the separation does not keep children safe, it does the opposite. The likelihood of incarceration increases, the risk of substance use, homelessness, lack of education, mental health disorders, generational problems, and sex trafficking are all significantly higher for young people that have been in foster care than their counterparts that did not experience removal. Family separation is the precursor for poor outcomes in all of these areas. We understand that those that are not directly impacted by systemic racism may not have the answer to how we effectively address disproportionality, but we do. One of the answers is the Minnesota African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act. This act would work to address the disparities at every decision point for all disproportionately represented children, a population that is too often overlooked. We ended a 3-year pilot of the bill in Hennepin County on 12/31/2023. We served over 200 families and successfully closed 90% without removal. We were able to prove that when the county shares power with family and community, child safety can be achieved while leaving the family intact. We will have the full report in February to share with all of you. We're asking that this body slow down and refrain from implementing sweeping laws for such a small percentage of children, laws that have already proven more harmful than helpful for marginalized communities. 5 minutes on the agenda does not allow us to adequately address all of the nuances of child welfare disproportionality and how the practice in Minnesota perpetuates it. We are hoping to meet with members in the near future to start the discussion. This issue deserves more time as a large majority of the families served are Black and brown. Their experience matters.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Thanks
Thank you.
to both of you for being here. Appreciate it. And so thank you. And so then our final testifier is Haile Tegenye, and please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
My name is Haile Tegenye. I'm with the East African Empowerment Center. I go by he, and I would like to thank Representative Dave Pinto and Member Task for this opportunity. I would like to share first, I would like to thank all of you guys for being here. And like our community members, we do believe that resources for the kids who need support and services is important, and to increase the funding. But after discussing with our community partners, we have learned some of the issues and concern, and I will provide some of the suggestions. One of the concerns is deep-rooted fears about what Child Protective Services does in our community, and a lot of people in our community are afraid to get those services they need. So, and a lot of the people do not want their their kids to be separated from the parents. So a lot of the community elders believe that kids need to be with their parents, and we need to work really hard to make sure that kids are not separated from the family, but if they were separated from the family, they should go to their immediate family members or the community that's around them. In order to do this, we believe that we need to provide, implement education to the communities around us. And the other issues that our community feel is that whenever Child Protective Services come to interact with the family, law enforcement are involved. So they believe that, especially in the initial case, that community elders, it could be a religious institution like the mosques or the faith-based organization, go with the county or child care protection service agents. Another one is a reporting issue in healthcare. Hospitals and doctors may report immigrant parents for minor incidents to language barriers or prejudice. And we believe we need to provide cultural competency training in the healthcare providers to reduce prejudice and improve communication with the patients. Also, establish a clear guidelines for reporting to avoid unnecessary interventions. Additionally, we believe community engagement and education is important. Increasing involvement of community liaison, organization, and leaders. Recognizing and addressing historical record of mistrust between child protection departments and community of colors. Finally, some of the suggestions we have is that to allocate resources to educate community about the function and the goals of Child Protection Department, and foster partnership between child protection agencies and community leaders for better understanding. A lot of our community members, whenever there's an issue of, we usually try to deal with these concerns individually. So if there's a parent who's struggling or who needs more training or education, immediate family are taking on those tasks and those roles, and it's a burden to those individuals and to those individuals. So there's a lot of community organizations, but they're not really aware about the resources or fund to provide education in the community. So what they want is to be at the table to discuss on how the counties provide services to the kids. So one of the other discussion I had, one of the partner, what she said is that we should have advisory group who in the counties or the different agencies that provide services that looks from our community. So whenever the county goes to protect the child or to provide that service, is that our community members are at stake providing guidelines and procedures so that they're not afraid to reach out to a government agency to get the resources they need the most. Thank you.
We're just over 5 minutes, but it sounds like you're concluded anyway. Is that
Yep.
correct? Yeah. Good. Thank you so much, Mr. Gianni. Thanks for being with us. And so, members, we have built a little bit of time on the agenda if there are questions for folks. This is, of course, just this is an ongoing conversation, of course, that we'll be having. I just want to make sure in case members have anything that they want to ask or otherwise, because otherwise we'll dive into the next segment. I'm not seeing any, and hoping somebody's keeping an eye and hands on the folks joining us via Zoom. So I do want to thank the folks who share their perspectives and to encourage them and all really to continue to be in touch with us. And I've had a number of meetings, I know that Senator Mitchell has as well. I know task force members really eager to consider the best way that we can make sure that every kid in our state is safe and is thriving and supporting families as well. So we will move on to the next segment of our agenda then and ask Tracy Laliberty to come up. And I believe that Don Winstead is joining us remotely. There was a reference by Ann Hill when she was testifying to looking at financing, and I know that that will be a component of this presentation, so I'm excited about that. We'll get Ms. Laliberty, Dr. Laliberty getting settled in. And then I'm not sure, I think that Don Winstead was going to be going first. Is that, is that correct? I think, okay. And so we have you on Zoom, so Don Winstead, once you're ready, please identify yourself for the record, and then please proceed.
Great. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty well. Yeah, if you can make sure to stay, close enough to your mic and keep your voice up and all that. But yeah.
I will certainly do that. Thank you, sir. And Chair Pinto and Chair Mitchell, thank you so much for allowing me to be with you and to zoom in remotely for this afternoon's task force meeting. Let me see, are the slides up?
They are not quite yet, so
Okay.
I think we'll have somebody working on that.
Okay, well, I'd say just by way of introduction.
Oh, here we go. No, I think we've got, well, maybe not. But yeah, you can, please be talking as you go, and we'll be working on it here in the room.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my name's Don Winstead. I'm a consultant to Casey Family Programs, and I have worked as a consultant for the past 12 years with a variety of states, counties, and tribes on issues primarily related to child welfare financing. Prior to that, I spent most of my career in state government in the state of Florida, was most recently Deputy Secretary of the Florida Department of Children and Families. I also worked for a while in Washington at the Department of Health and Human Services as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy at HHS. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And I thought I saw what looked like some slides starting to come up. And,
we're working on.
okay. Yep. It's technology is always a challenge.
Indeed. Let's give it a second here. I think we're gonna try another method here. So it is always something, isn't it?
Always.
Yeah. All right, our staff is working on this.
Great picture.
And for those others with us remotely, we're working on it. Oh.
Okay, and that's the presenter view, and I think if somebody can do the where it says display options, it should give you an option to switch it to the full screen view.
We're trying.
Yep, there.
This one?
Yes. Yes. There you
Okay,
go.
I think we're in good shape. All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. And so we now can see it. Your slide, Child Welfare Funding Sources, is up. It's moved to a second slide, key point, and away you go.
Okay, let me start there. And anytime I talk about child welfare financing, I just like to start with this point. that sometimes we get so focused on issues like how do we get more federal funding or whatever, that it's easy to view funding as a goal in and of itself, and of course it's not. As you well know, and as your previous presenters have talked about, the important thing is your vision and your goals for children and families in Minnesota. Funding is important, but it's funding is important because it's gas in the tank. It's what gets you toward your goal so that you can achieve that for children and families. Next slide. So I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the child welfare funding sources, give you an overview of some of the financial information, and then Dr. Lala Birdie will talk more specifically about some of the jurisdiction and governance issues. Next slide. When we talk about child welfare financing and child welfare funding, from a federal perspective, we separate funds into two broad categories, dedicated funds and non-dedicated funds. This slide shows the dedicated funds, and what I mean by dedicated funds is these are funds that are used for child welfare. In other words, you cannot use these funds to do things other than child welfare, and each of the funding streams has specific purposes attached to it. Title 4B of the Social Security Act is one of the major funding sources. There are two subparts to that, both of which provide fixed funding for states for child welfare purposes. CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, is another funding source, and within CAPTA there is a formula grant to states and also a community-based child abuse prevention grant. And then the major funding source is Title 4E of the Social Security Act, which now includes foster care, adoption assistance, guardianship assistance, the CHAFE program for successful transitions to adulthood, then new now in place are prevention services and 4E kinship navigator services. So these are the dedicated funds for child welfare. Next slide. The non-dedicated funds, and by non-dedicated funds, what I mean are these are funding sources which at your discretion may be used by the state and counties for child welfare, or they may be used for other purposes. And the major ones here are the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or TANF, the Social Services Block Grant, Medicaid, and by Medicaid, as I'm going to use it this afternoon, of course, all children in foster care are Medicaid eligible for their health care, but in addition, some states can get Medicaid funding for things like targeted case management or rehabilitation services and other services. So those are also part of the mix for child welfare. SSI and SSDI, many children may qualify for supplemental security income or social security disability or survivor benefits. And all states put in state funding beyond matching requirements. Some states do more than others, and I'll talk more specifically about that. Next slide. So there is a survey that an organization called Child Trends, a national research organization, they get funded by Casey Family Programs and also the Annie E. Casey Foundation to do a survey every 2 years of all states and ask questions about financing. This shows the results of the most recently published survey. It was published in May of 2023 and covers state fiscal year 2020, showing federal funding by those major sources totaling $15.2 billion. So this is national total. As you can see, of the federal funding sources, 59% was from 4E, 17% TANF, SSBG 10%, and the other percentages shown there. So that's the nation. Next slide shows Minnesota. So with Minnesota, you see a couple of differences. First, the SSBG percentage is about the same. A much higher percentage of Medicaid-related expenditures, probably related to targeted case management there. The 4B is about the same. TANF is a little, is not shown at all, so no TANF funds there. And 4E is a little bit lower percentage, but that's largely because the percentages are all altered by the significant amount of Medicaid that was identified in the Minnesota survey. Next slide. So, as I say, there are, when you look nationally, and all the funding that was identified, and nationally about $31.4 billion in child welfare expenditures, state funds, and this state really is a kind of a substitute term for state and local on this slide. So it's basically non-federal sources, and of course in Minnesota would include state and local sources. So those non-federal sources are the majority of the funds, about 57% overall, where the federal funds are about 43%. That 57% of the non-federal share, some of that is required for matching funds and some of that is beyond matching requirements, and that varies a lot state to state. Next slide. So this just kind of recaps, and Dr. Lala Birdie will go over this a bit more in detail on some of these issues, but as the chair mentioned earlier, Minnesota is a county-operated system. This map just shows the state by state, the state versus county operation. Most states are state-administered, state-operated. There are about 9 systems that are county-operated, and then there are 2 systems that are hybrid systems. That is, part of the state is county operated and part of the state is state operated, that being Nevada and Wisconsin. But although the majority of the systems are state operated, when you look, some of the larger systems in the country are county operated. So although it's only 18% of the states have county operated systems, those states include 31% of the children in foster care, and that's largely because county operated states include California and New York. So some of the very large systems are included in that calculation. Next slide. So here's an example of sometimes when technology bites. We've already seen technology at work today, and this was a little technology glitch as our slides got put together, my slides and Dr. Lala Birdie's slides, a graph got dropped out. So I'm going to ask your indulgence and ask you to use your imaginations for a minute, because what you should see on this slide is a graph that shows the state or state and county versus federal. So the federal and non-federal percentage by state, showing with highlights for the county administered states versus the state administered. The bottom line, as the note says there, is that there's one county administered system that was not able to answer the question on the survey about the amount of non-federal funds, and that was California, which is a big one. And there were some technical reasons there that probably aren't relevant to your discussion. But of the other systems that were all the systems in the country, of the 8 remaining county-operated systems, 7 of those 8 had non-federal expenditures, that is, state and local percentage of expenditures greater than the national average. So one of the things that is a little unique about county-operated systems is, on balance, they tend to have more non-federal funds contributing to child welfare than the state-administered systems. So, for example, Minnesota then was 69% of non-federal, as opposed to the amount of the national share that was 57%. Ohio was 62, Virginia 62, New York 62, Colorado 64, Minnesota 69, and Pennsylvania 75%. So there, and we'll get you a revised copy of this so you can see that, Mr. Chairman, but But overall, that one of the uniquenesses, or at least differentiations of state versus county administered system, seems to be the commitment of the non-federal share. Next slide.
Well, actually, Mr. Winstead, I'm going to take
Yeah.
Chair's prerogative to just ask a clarifying question. And if folks have
Sure.
clarifying questions, we can do them. Of course, we'll save for discussion. But your slide says that that state and local expenditures above the U.S. average, which implies to me sort of a dollar amount or a dollar per child. But when you described the graph we can't see, or the figure we can't see, that you're describing that the proportion that is state and local versus the proportion that is federal of total spending per state is higher for county-administered systems. So can you just clarify that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, and I think if you could see the graph with the percentages, it would be clearer. This was designed to go along with the prior graph that showed 57% non-federal and 43% federal, and that just shows the same information state by state. So what it shows is it's not the amount of expenditures, it's the percentage of expenditures that are state or local compared to total expenditures.
So Mr. Winstead, so that those county-administered states, those 7, on average, have a greater proportion of their total child welfare spending coming from state and local sources of financing as opposed to federal. And I can see Dr. Oliver's nodding. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. All right. Please continue.
Great. Next slide. So just 2 additional slides before I do a couple of wrap-up comments. Just going forward, one of the important issues in child welfare, of course, is the Family First Prevention Services Act implementation. Now we're up where most states have either implemented, in fact, most states have gotten approval of their Family First Prevention Services plans. Only a few states are pending 4 of those, and 4 states that have not submitted plans, but most have submitted plans and most have been approved. Minnesota is one of the approved states. When we look at the dollar claiming, and next slide, see a different pattern, and what's happening there is when states are approved for their plans, there's usually a lag between that approval and the time that they are implementing and claiming federal funds. So even though most states have gotten it, only a little over half of states are now claiming or have begun the claiming process. And Minnesota is in one of those groups that has not yet begun claiming Family First Prevention Services funds. So I think something to watch going forward will be how rapidly those prevention services can qualify for federal claiming. Next slide. So I'll conclude my comments with just some observations that first of all, like most states, 4E is the largest source of federal funds for Minnesota, and the percentage of the non-federal share is above average. One of the things just to mention is, as I said, one of the differences is that Minnesota is a state that does not spend any temporary assistance for needy families, block grant funds on child welfare. There are 8 states that do not. So Minnesota is one of those 8 states, although there is a procedure where you can transfer a portion of your TANF funds to social services block grant, so that can be part of the SSBG funding. Minnesota's unobligated balances, and without getting too much into the weeds, one of the uniquenesses of TANF is states can carry forward unspent federal funds without fiscal year limitation and can accrue an unobligated balance. And as of September 30, 2021, Minnesota had $141 million in unobligated TANF funds. The Family First Prevention Plan has been approved, but has not yet, claiming has not yet begun. That's probably will be soon in the pipeline. But the key point there is all the federal funding sources that are available for child welfare, there are 2 that are uncapped. So most of the federal funding sources, 4B, CAPTA, et cetera, are capped funding sources. The two exceptions to that are Title IV-E and Medicaid, and the growth potential is largely in the prevention services area of Title IV-E. And so going forward to potentially, if you can identify state or local funds that aren't being used to match federal funds that are being used for prevention services, that's an opportunity potentially going forward to build out your prevention services to prevent children from coming into at-home care if they can safely remain at home with services. So with that, I'll turn over to Dr. Lalaberty, and then we'll be on and be glad to try to address any questions.
That sounds good. Thank you so much for your presentation. And as we move into the next presentation, just again confirming, Senator Champion, yeah.
Thank you so much. To the testifier, I have a couple quick questions. When you say Family First, are you talking about the state of Minnesota's reunification plan and whether that was approved as far as our process? Is that what you're referring to, number one? And number two, how does North Star operate in this whole thing? Because it's my understanding that in order for us to get a reimbursement from the federal government, it's a part of a North Star program, something around North Star, and North Star requires that the child protection process happens within a certain prescribed amount of time. So if you could provide clarification around those things as it relates to the 4E and North Star.
Mr. Winstead, if you can take kind of each of those in turn.
Sure. So first of all, on the Family First Prevention Services Plan, it's a federal law that passed 5 years ago, and in order to tap those funds, and family reunification may be part of it. I'm not sure what different states attach different names to their plans, but essentially this plan is one that had to be developed and meet federal requirements and submitted by the state to the Children's Bureau, where there was a lengthy review and dialogue process, and Minnesota's Family First Prevention Services Plan was approved, was listed as approved about a year ago. That's the plan. As far as North Star, I'm not familiar with that. I'm not, I apologize, I'm not up to speed.
Yeah, so I think what I want to do is because we're going to have another presentation, is sort of have clarifying questions for Mr. Winstead, and there's a lot of time we build in for discussion. Is that, if that's okay with Senator Champion, Senator Hoffman? Senator Hoffman, you got something you want?
No, Mr. Chair, actually, Jennifer Sommerfeld is here from the Department of Human Services, who has some information for us that would be helpful in this conversation. And if she can stick around, maybe we'll just do that later.
Let me make sure Ms. Sommerfeld is going to be here. I suspect that she will be here. I see her nodding. So good. So let's make sure you've got those questions from Senator Champion and Senator Hoffman as well, and we'll do those, kind of get those. So I feel like we'll get to those. Why don't we pivot to Dr. Lalaberty, then we'll get through your presentation and then be able to have a discussion about all of this. And so if you can please identify yourself for the record and then proceed as you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Tracy Lalaberty, and I work at the University of Minnesota. I run a research and training center in the School of Social Work that's called the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. And today I am going to talk a little bit about and try to fill in some of the gaps around strengths, challenges, different considerations between state-administered child welfare systems and county-administered child welfare systems. And what I'm going to present to you is really based upon published reports and studies, some personal experience or collaborations that occur nationally. Now, that said, that's where it's coming from. There isn't a lot available, and as you'll see from the slides, there isn't a tremendous amount that is published in academic or scientific literature about the comparisons or the contrast between these systems, and what we do have tends to be dated and you'll see quite old. Still, I do think that there are things that we can glean from what is out there and can learn. So this is a similar map that Don had in his slides as well that really just kind of depicts visually the different states who self-identify when they report to the federal government whether they're state or county administered systems or hybrid. So we have 9 county administered systems, which are in the gold, school colors, and we have 40 states that are identifying as state structures, and then the 2 states that self-identify as hybrid structures, Wisconsin and Nevada, are the striped. And in the presentation, you'll hear later, so just kind of keep in your mind, you've got 9 and you've got these 40 with the extra 2. You'll start to see that the 40 might not actually be 40. But again, they're self-reported in that way. So 20 years ago, the feds decided that they wanted to really look at the differences and see if there were key differences between administrative structures. And actually, I think Don, who testified before myself, was part of this when he was working with the feds. And this kind of a comparison or study has not been repeated in that period of time. At that time, what they found in the state-administered systems was that there was that state-operated systems tended to have highly specialized workforce as compared to county-operated systems, that they were more structured, that they had more structured processes, rather, for how they were implementing all of the different child welfare activities that were assigned. In contrast, county-administered systems were found to be much more flexible and more connected with local resources and communities in that way. So that was really kind of the big takeaway from that study quite a long time ago. As we look across a number of studies, and again, you'll see that they're quite dated, there really is no clear advantage that emerges for a state-operated system or a county-operated system in any study. The results are really rather mixed in terms of even what the advantages or disadvantages might be, and all of that has to do with who they studied and how they studied. A number of these studies really just compared like 2 systems, like 2 states, which really isn't generalizable. I think in our discussions before we came to do our testimony, as Don and I were talking, he had mentioned to me, you know, when you see one child welfare system in the country, you've seen one child welfare system in the country. And it's very, very true in terms of whether it's the financing or the operations, the workforce, et cetera. So what we start to see in some of the studies that I've listed here on this screen is that you have pure state systems that are state-operated, they're delivering the service, and they have all the oversight. You have state systems that have what they call strong county operation. In the map, they're identifying as state systems, but the reality is they're more like our hybrids, where the state is really has the oversight and some service delivery, but much of the decision-making happens at the local county level or regional level, depending upon how they're set up. And in the counties, again, as I mentioned, closer connections to providers, families, communities. Now, we mentioned those hybrid structures. There's really not much that's in the published literature about hybrid structures at all. It's, they've kind of evolved and started to become these self-identified entities. Both Wisconsin and Nevada emerged from settlement agreements. They were a reform effort that emerged over time. In Wisconsin, the state is county administered with the exception of Milwaukee County, which has been state administered based on settlement agreements since the 90s. And in Nevada, and this was reported federally in 2018, but even this has changed a little bit. Nevada looks as though it has 3 regional areas of operation, some that are state administered, some that are county administered, and some of that, again, has fluctuated. So what we know is that decision-making and responsibility often rests with localities and local offices, regardless of administrative structure. So whether it's the state, or it is state with strong county presence, or county or hybrid, the decisions that are factoring into all of the statistics that you're hearing over and over and over are really driven at a local level. You'll see that only 7 of the states that self-identify as state-operated systems, state-administered systems, truly deliver all CPS functions themselves. So then you've got 33 of those other states that are how they categorize strong county structure, right? State system with strong county structure. Maryland would be a great example of that. So if we think about impact, I know we often want to know, well, what's the impact? Regardless of how it works for the professionals or the systems, what's the impact? And is there a difference that's experienced by kids or families and people in the community? And very few studies in the last 25 years have been able to really look at that in terms of using administrative structure as a key indicator in the analysis. You can see kind of the main studies. I've listed those there for you. I think that what we can draw from all of these studies is essentially that no system is just categorically better than any other system. Nothing emerges in that way. And that rather it's really about trade-offs, and the trade-offs have value depending upon the local context. So the message back to Minnesota is, could we have shifts to a state, more of a state-operated system or a state-administered? You could, but there's a trade-off. There's huge financial implications, as Don had talked about. It isn't necessarily that is going to garner you guaranteed better outcomes or more efficient, effective systems in any way, shape, or form. Studies examining whether administrative structures impact the performance are really limited. These are things that I've already talked about. Challenges really remain in terms of as researchers are trying to pull together some of these comparisons. There's just so much variability in each system. Grouping them and being able to make those comparisons has just flummoxed. Another area, in addition to impact, that I know people are interested in the committee as well as in the community is the workforce. Beyond the impact on kids and families, we're also concerned about our workforce and mindful that we have a lot of challenges in terms of turnover, training, and things like that. Since the pandemic, Casey Families has reported that turnover rates across the country in child welfare are anywhere between 33 and 45%. Those are high rates and things that different localities are all managing in different ways. When it comes to applying the lens of does an administrative structure make a difference, the answer is no. All of those different administrative structured entities or jurisdictions experience turnover at similar rates. Mr. Chair, I know you wanted us to stop at about 2:30 for questions. I have.
Thank you. And that was, I was thinking about 30 minutes, but of course it took us quite a while to start with Mr. Winstead. So okay. Please do keep on going. And I will say I'm finding this just pulled together really, really helpfully. And so thank you so much. So yeah, no, please keep on going. Again, if there are clarifying questions folks have, let me know. Otherwise, we budget a lot of time for discussion afterwards. So please continue.
Okay. I have just 3 last slides and then maybe some summary and considerations. The final slides that I have really focus on consent decrees and settlement agreements. And these are things that are just everyday factors for us in the field of child welfare nationally. These, of course, are the results of class action lawsuits or litigation that really try to hold our systems accountable. And there is there is something to be learned in terms of how consent decrees and settlements have been experienced or have occurred within the state versus county system. So just a couple things to talk about. 87% of state-administered systems have faced or are currently under and facing class action litigation, compared to just 44% of county-administered systems. So there is a significant difference in that regard. 35 or 85% of the 41 jurisdictions that are currently under consent decrees or settlement agreements, which had exited a consent decree, were, again, state administered. This slide just gives you some additional information. I'll let you review that on your own. But really looking at, of the 9 county administered systems, about a third of them face litigation resulting in either a consent decree or a settlement agreement. So that does include us in Minnesota with Hennepin County. Hennepin County has successfully exited that as of December of '23. This slide really looks at, if you look at the different boxes, the top box that says 6 is about consent decrees. So 6 state-administered systems are currently under consent decrees. And as you can see, consent decrees tend to last for a much, much longer period of time. Some states have been in or are currently in consent decrees that have lasted more than 30 years with federal oversight to their child welfare systems. The box that says 11, there's 11 state-administered systems under settlement agreements, which tend to, again, be shorter in length, although we do have one that is 11 years in length. And then 6 state-administered systems were under consent decrees or settlement agreements and have successfully exited. The longest lasting was 31 years in the state of Connecticut. So just in summary and with some consideration, I think first, I'll step outside my slides for a second and say I really agree with Ariana's presentation in the first section that our most critical need of investment is in services, hands down, above and beyond. I think the workforce is worth investment, and certainly we want to pay attention to systems, but none of that works if we don't have services that are designed to and help and are beneficial for the kids and families that we serve. So that said, I will frame the rest of this around that. I think that while little is known about, scientifically known, that we could statistically point to that advantages state versus county systems, what we do know from all of the studies is that the decision-making really happens at the local entity. And so the ways that we can best support our local entities and ensure that they have the structure, the processes that are in place, the guidance, the technical assistance, the stronger that those local entities are going to be, regardless of what kind of system. I think if we're going to invest additional state dollars into the system side of things, it really is about investing so that those local entities have the resources they need, the services that they need to be able to provide the high-quality services that we know kids and families deserve in Minnesota. Another area, and I know we're going to talk about this later, is potentially moving that a little bit more toward that needle of a hybrid system. There seems to be some advantage to that, and the majority of the states, when we break down those state-supervised but strong county-present states, those 33 states, along with the 2 identified hybrids, 35 states are really operating in a very collaborative state-county process and partnership. And an example of that, it certainly doesn't have to be this, but an example of that is if, state takes on the role and responsibility within a centralized hotline, and the counties then have the authority and the jurisdiction and the implementation of services at that point. I included a quote here from a Casey Family Program publication that I thought was really kind of poignant, again, maybe leading more into the later presentation, but getting the screening decision right, whether to screen a case in or out, is one of the most important functions of a child protection agency. States that switch to a centralized intake system typically do so to deliver greater consistency and accountability in screening decisions. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, I'm going to interject, that an individual county isn't doing a good job. But when we look across the state of Minnesota, and the legislative auditor did a report in 2012, we want to make sure that regardless of where kids and families live in the state of Minnesota, they're being assessed equally. They're being assessed fairly across what our standards and statutes are. Most centralized systems include staff dedicated solely to screening hotline calls, and the centralized administrative functions for these staff, including standardized training, standardized decision tools, and quality monitoring processes. Centralized intake systems can also support implementation of large-scale policy and practice changes in a more consistent and timely manner. Decentralized systems are also effective, but issues related to consistency and accountability often need further attention. And with that, I'll conclude.
Yeah, and so Dr. Laliberte, in all, that last bit that you were talking about, I believe connects pretty strongly with what's listed on item 5 on our agenda. And I expect that items 5 and 4, just as a little preview, will flip because it is such a strong connection with item number 3, which we're in the middle of now. So just sort of for folks to be aware of that. But with that, we'll move to discussion. We've got Senator Champion, Senator Hoffman are sort of first in line in that order. So Senator Champion, pardon me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the testifier. Just one quick question. When you talk about the differences in the systems, right, the county administrated or the state supervised system, and whether someone is going to move to a state administered system, that you wrote here that getting the screening decision right, whether to screen a case in or out of the system, is one of the most important functions of a child protection agency. And then you talked about states that switch to a centralized intake system typically do so to deliver greater consistency and accountability in screening decisions. And so my question is, based on your research, what impact does that have on the centralized process? What impact does that have on population differences, cultural considerations, and input or impact on cultural services? Because my understanding in a state like Minnesota, there's this whole desire and need for there to be more cultural services. So tell me how those two things interact with each other when you talk about centralization and consistency. And when you think in terms of standardized, that causes me a little trepidation. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to know what your research has yielded as it pertains to that when it comes to communities of color as well.
Dr. Laliberte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Champion, I think there's a couple things to unpack in that. I think this quote is from Casey Family Programs, and I think what it is getting at is really looking at when you have a team of screeners and that's all they're doing, and you develop the consistency and the structure around how they're hearing that statute, how they're applying the statute in different contexts and scenarios. They're doing that not necessarily based on their local geographic experience or influence of bias, but they're leveling that judgment across the state, and that there is advantage to that for communities that otherwise may feel as though they're being targeted in one community versus another. The rates can be higher in one county of disparity than in another. Now, can it work the opposite? Absolutely. I mean, if you don't have a well-trained system, and I think that part of what I think will get talked about later, it's too hard to disentangle it. You know, those things have to be studied. In what centralized areas that have such a function, is it working well? Are they doing blind reviews, for instance, where they are able to moderate bias and discrimination more? There's one study, I think, that you were asking about just in general of decentralized and centralized systems, a study from 2019, and in that system, or in that study, they used national data, AFCAR's data, to look at whether kids receive permanent legal connections more often in a centralized or a decentralized system. They were really using administrative data to look at that. And of course, one of the things that they looked at was race. And they found no significant difference in achievement of permanency placement for children of color in decentralized or centralized systems. That regardless of that structure, some of that disparity it was held constant between the two kinds of systems. So I think that there's a couple things that you were asking me, and I hope I answered them. If not, please.
And as I send it back to Senator Champion, just to remind him and all that that the piece about us possibly centralized screening, we do have a separate agenda item and kind of a short presentation by Dr. Lalaberty and Representative Hicks, so we can get to that. But I'll direct back to you, Senator Champion, in case you have anything else.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I won't belabor the point. I'll wait to hear the rest, but I will say this, that even when you think in terms of designing of a system, if there's already bias in the way it's designed, then it's going to have a strange sort of impact on others because it's perceived a certain way, it's designed a certain way. And so it's like the whole argument around standardized tests when you think in terms of communities of color, because of the way it's designed,
correct,
there will be some inequities or bias. And so that also ties into when you say it was working well, and I wrote down a question, working well for who, right? And so that requires a little consideration as well. But I'll wait until the others.
You've given a helpful preview, helpful heads up to Dr. Lalaberty and Representative Hicks to some things that they'll need to address in a very short period of time. Senator Hoffman was in line next. I think Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. This was a compelling bit of information to take in, and I'm glad you talked about the county, the debate between a county structured or a centralized structure to see the data that's there. But what I have, and I'll share with you, Mr. Chair and Madam Chair, is there was a report that I had a social work master's degree intern do and looked at all the counties in the state of Minnesota regarding looking for information about child protection and adult protection resources. And it'd be interesting because you're looking at this. And first of all, I just want to say, Don Winstead, absolutely wonderful to see you again. I mean, in the years 2001 to 2004, when I was in the Bush administration, he was Assistant Secretary. And I'll never forget Miles Golson back then on the Federal Energy Coordinating Council had talked about the Title IV-E and the flexibility and structuring. And so it's kind of a segue into now that we have Jennifer Sommerfeld here to answer the question on the Title IV-E that comes up. But as she works her way up here, I just wanted to highlight.
Please do, Ms. Sommerfeld. It sounds like we got a question for you from Senator Hoffman, so if you can please make your way up. But Senator Hoffman, we'll keep going.
As you highlight, I just wanted to look at this, right? It's a pretty thick report, and I'm not using this. I mean, it's actual county by county, and I showed the good senator from Washington County next to me just how Washington County fares in it. But the student found no information on how to report child abuse in 4 counties, right? 4 counties, 0. You go there and you get lost. I looked at those 4 counties. I won't name them, but you know, if you want to know, I'll give you the names of those. The message on the report varied from a single sentence to a full paragraph in all the other counties. So there's no consistency on how I can find information. 28 counties did not have any outline form to report child protection issues, period. 13 counties provide at least one resource, just one, at least one on child abuse. Then you look at adult protection, and one county in adult protection has no information about reporting adult protection issues, period. 2 additional counties do not even mention MARC, which is the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center, and Jennifer can talk about that if she wants, but 53 counties provided a phone number for MARC. 9 counties provided only a website for MARC. 20 counties provided both the phone number of Mark and the website link to Mark, so you can fill information out. So to the point, right, that there's inconsistency on how we apply it, going to which way do we go, centralized or not centralized, or hybrid, or, but better yet, as we're looking at it, how are we devolving information out? And it was good to have you and Assistant Secretary Winstead here. I wish you would have been here in person, but that's okay. We can do the Zoom thing. But with that, if Jennifer, Ms. Sommerfeld, who is at Department of Human Services, that 4E piece that everybody kind of highlighted, could you help us understand that?
Ms. Sommerfeld, do you feel like, if you feel like you're clear enough on the question being asked of you, if you could please identify yourself and then answer. She is clear, Senator Hoffman says. Sommerfeld.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. If you could just re-ask the question so that I make sure I'm answering it in a way that's appropriate, that would be great.
Senator Hoffman.
So one of the things that came up was the aha moment when you saw the states, and I came back to you because Senator Champion had leaned over to you and said, interesting that we haven't accessed or got, so the question is, why haven't we got the money? And I went to you and I said, why haven't we got the money? And of course you explained the why and then the process, and then some of the potential issues that are around if something doesn't go a certain way, how the counties then are going to be on the hook for something. So if you could explain that, please help us understand, that would be great.
Ms. Sommerfeld.
Certainly, thank you. Senator Hoffman, I'm a little out of practice right now. So yes, Minnesota did receive approval of our prevention services plan, but we have submitted a cost allocation plan to the federal government that needs to be approved before we can be assured that if we claim for prevention services or certain costs that we will be able to be reimbursed. So without that federal approval, and we've been waiting for 18 months, 18 months to get that approval, yes, at the federal level. If counties do claiming, or the state does some claiming, however that works, I don't have the greatest detailed knowledge of how 4E claiming works, we're at risk of not being reimbursed. So I think we're all waiting to get our cost allocation plan approved.
And back to Senator Hoffman.
So how, do you hear that at risk, Mr. Chair, at risk for not getting reimbursed? How much money is that? Do you know off the top of your head?
I do not off the top of my head, but certainly we can get back to you. I mean, it's for prevention services, which is different than other funding that we currently get reimbursed for 4E. So for example, for Family First, it was kind of a carrot and stick act, and part of the stick was to make it more difficult for states to be able to place children in congregate foster care settings. And so there are requirements related to what has to be done before a child can be placed that way. I'm not going to dig into the details on that. It would take me probably an hour. But over the last few years, Minnesota has worked, the department has worked closely with legislators and the governor's office to make sure that we've passed all the federal requirements for Family First so that counties can claim 4E that might otherwise be lost if they had not met those federal requirements. So the feds were saying, if you don't follow these requirements, we're not going to provide you with reimbursement in eligible cases. So that is an area where we are getting, we are following Family First and getting reimbursements appropriately.
And Senator Hoffman, further, anything else?
Thank you. That clarifies that piece. Okay. I know I saw Representative Hicks shaking her head too in the back, so maybe we want to follow up with her on this as well.
Maybe we should be able to. Maybe not. Senator Champion, you had something
If I could ask the testifier just to talk a little bit about North Star. How does North Star connect in here, or am I getting the word wrong? But I believe it's North Star funding that a child protection case is on a certain timeline, and it has to begin and end within a certain prescribed amount of time in order for funding to be available for even a family. Like I think if a family is doing foster care or something like that, that within a certain amount of time the child has to be in the home for 6 months before there can be funding. Can you talk a little bit about North Star and how that plays into it? Because there's a belief that law also expedites any way to reunify a family.
And I might ask as you start, just if you can define what North Star is for folks who may not be as familiar, but please, Ms. Sommerfeld.
Certainly, and I forgot to introduce myself, so I will quickly do that. I'm Jennifer Sommerfeld with the Department of Human Services. Mr. Chair, Senator Champion, I cannot really dig into detail into what North Star funding works in the timeline, so we'll really have to follow up on that. It's very complicated. And I'm not a North Star subject matter expert, or am I a subject matter expert on 4E, as I said. But we'll have to dig into that and get you some information. And North Star broadly is a program that provides foster care and adoption assistance to families who are caring for children who are in out-of-home placements or kin and adoptive parents who've adopted or taken custody of children out of the foster care system.
So it sounds like some information to give back to Senator Champion. But Senator Champion, anything further now, sir?
Nope.
Okay. Anything from other members? I'm assuming staff will let me know if there's hands raised on the Zoom at all. And there does not appear to be. This was extremely, extremely informative. Thank you, Ms. Sommerfeld and Dr. Laliberte and Mr. Winstead. Really, really helpful information for us. And if I know we've got your information as well to connect members with. And with that, I'm going to have you stay up there, though, Dr. Laliberte, and we're going to move to item number 5 on our agenda. And apologies if anybody has any concerns with that. And Representative Hicks, come on up. There is a several-page slideshow which is titled "Exploring a Hybrid Approach to Child Welfare." This goes with our agenda item, consideration of statewide maltreatment reporting system, and is a really nice connection with that final discussion that was being had about a statewide screening hotline and that quote from Dr. Laliberte. So we can dive on in. We're really glad to have Representative Kim Hicks with us, and I'm not sure how you all want to proceed with this. Representative Hicks, Dr. Laliberte, but I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Chair. Our esteemed colleague here does a wonderful job of explaining the details, so I will not make myself look less intelligent. I will let the smart people be the smart people, and go ahead and kick us off.
Dr. Laliberte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just recently, Representative Hicks and I connected, and she was exploring some interest in whether or not there would be merit and need for Minnesota to be responsive in terms of adopting a statewide or centralized reporting system. And so I certainly agreed to help and to offer our center to be able to dig in and do some research or looking at that, and to be able to help in whatever way we could. That really hasn't happened to any degree in terms of the depth. We've just kind of started, but I think that Representative Hicks, if I can speak for her a little bit, was really interested in making sure that this committee understood maybe a trajectory of how it is that this would be potentially explored, and what has been done and what hasn't been done. So this is really just a kind of a walkthrough in terms of thinking about in relation to the presentation that I just did. One option that is available to states is to centralize part of its system and not others. I'm not here to necessarily advocate for one thing or another, and yet but rather to just really lay out that there are some choices and some opportunities for people to explore, and I think gather more information to be able to understand whether or not this is in Minnesota's best interest or not. And I do think that there are many people that need to be part of that discussion, from counties, 4E tribes, community providers, et cetera. So that, under that whole context, we present you with just some information that we know that in Minnesota, the child welfare system, we're always looking at the child welfare system, but there's been increased scrutiny of Minnesota's child welfare system. Since 2012, the Legislative Auditor's Office did a big report looking at the consistency of screening across the state, and they had a number of recommendations that focused on mandated reporting, screening, things like that. And then we know in the governor's task force in 2014, 15, 16, when we got recommendations. And that one thing that comes up over and over and over is that intake piece and the consistency or the inconsistency across the state. And so this just might be the time, again, you may or may not act, the legislation may or may not act, but it is probably time to really do a deep, deep dive at understanding what would the, what are some of the strengths of doing this? What would some of the challenges be? What would some unintended consequences potentially be? And exploring that. Like I said, one approach taken by other states is to share the responsibilities between state and county in terms of dividing some of the implementation of child welfare activity. And one piece that's kind of easily pulled out, as we've seen in other states, is a centralized reporting system, leaving the vast majority of the child welfare system still in the hands of the local entities with authority and responsibility. An exploration to determine feasibility, cost potential in Minnesota related to a centralized intake was part of the governor's task force recommendations. It was recommendation number 24. And the state was able to, my understanding was that the state was able to work with the Capacity Building Center for States in terms of starting to have some of those conversations, but an in-depth report or study with recommendations did not occur. And so, yep.
Yeah, Dr. Lala, I'm just going to pause you just to note for members of the task force, members of the public, that there's a one-page document that says Governor's Task Force on Protection of Children, March 2015, that actually includes that recommendation number 24 that Dr. Lalaberty is referencing back from then. And so just to kind of, we have that with us. So yeah, please continue.
Great, thanks. And again, the benefits and disadvantages of both centralized hotline and the shift to hybrid systems is something that we really have to thoroughly explore and have a great conversation and lots of voices at the table for that. That said, we are not starting from ground zero on this. Casey Programs, and I included a hyperlink in here if people are interested in looking at it, did a report on 2018 in terms of effectiveness and efficiencies of centralized hotlines and intake, so I think that's a good starting point. I do think that there are a number of states that we know of with recent shifts toward centralized hotlines, and some have moved away from centralized hotlines. And so really gaining a deep understanding of why were those states doing those things, what were the impacts to that, and how did they see how that impacted kids and families is really what we need to be paying attention to and prioritizing. We also aren't starting from ground zero. Somebody earlier had, I think Senator Hoffman had referenced the MARC. You know, Minnesota recently implemented the centralized reporting for adult protection, and there's lessons to be learned there. There's lessons to be learned in terms of how it's functioning, what are people happy with, what are they not, the implementation, what were the bugs, how did, what was the squeaky part that, perhaps another approach could do differently. There's advantages, like, again, Senator Hoffman had talked about. Okay, so in full disclosure, I came from a place that was a state-operated system that had a state hotline, so it was very interesting to me as I learned the Minnesota system, and that was 25 years ago. But you never couldn't figure out who to call. And I think that in Minnesota, there's a lot of people that can't figure out, like, who do I call? Or it happened over here, and so I call this place, and they're like, well, everything that you've told me, you really got to go call over here. It's frustrating for folks, and I think that it leaves the opportunity for gaps in safety and in safety nets for kids and families. So there's just even some of those small mechanical pieces from the community standpoint that we can shore up, or at least look at what those benefits might be. I think the most important piece, and I think this is the last slide or close to the last slide, and something that Representative Hicks and I have talked about a lot, is this comes down to critical analysis. This isn't a knee-jerk reaction. We've got to do something. The Strib articles are terrible. Everything that's happening is terrible. We've heard a tremendous amount of testimony in the first segment here in terms of how the system is impacting and differentially impacting different communities. I think any big reform or transformation effort that we do doesn't have to be slow, but it has to be critical. We can't just act. We have to know, if we do this, what are we going to lose? If we do this, what are we going to gain? And I really think you do that through a pretty deep study with lots of informants in a variety of different ways and formats, and you do some site visits to other jurisdictions and entities. Technology is also a really big factor here in terms of how centralized reporting and how shared responsibility and authority between state and county partners can live. I don't think that this is going to be successful if the counties don't have some capacity for administrative veto power, or some administrative capacity to be able to say, well, gosh, actually in our local community, we know this, this, and this isn't appropriate. And that then there is a mechanism for dialogue and for checks and balances. So I think that there's lots of those intricacies that need to be critically analyzed, and then people can make a decision about whether or not this is good for Minnesota. And I believe that then Representative Hicks will pursue, what does that look like? How do we get to that point?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laliberty. So I'm going to send it back to Representative Hicks if you want to share some thoughts about kind of where you're thinking about taking this. Representative Hicks.
Yes, thank you. So as we talk about how we figure out what works for Minnesota, I think it's really important that we have information and data. But as my colleague here shared, we don't want to take too long. And critical doesn't have to mean slow. There's a lot of data that's already out there. There's a lot of information that's available. And I think we can propose a tight turnaround for a summary of the highlights that we've discussed here today, of what are we looking for? What are those key pieces of information? So that we can come back to the table and move forward with a true plan that is representative of what we need in Minnesota, taking into account our unique system that we have currently, making any needed changes, but also hearing from Minnesotans, hearing from our counties, hearing from our tribes, hearing from our foster youth, hearing from our families, hearing from our relative caregivers, making sure we're hearing those voices as part of the conversation so that we don't act in a way that is a knee-jerk reaction that leads us into yet another problem. So my plan this session is to draft a bill to start us down this path that we've outlined today, understanding that this is a step one to a really complex problem. And so my ask today from the task force members is to please be engaged in that conversation with me as we work to figure out what that looks like. There is not a perfect solution, because if there was, all 50 states would already be doing it. So we need to work to figure out what is the best solution for the state of Minnesota. And I think together with the work of the committed legislators on this task force and our community partners who are vested and informed in the research, and our county and tribes and our families, we can work together to find a solution that's really going to work for Minnesotans and move us forward. I frequently tell my children that doing nothing is a choice, but typically it's a bad one. So I think it's time to start doing something.
Representative Hicks, thank you so much. And I should note for members, I think part of the thinking about this agenda item and then the next agenda item, number 4, is that we're hearing some ideas, and this is an opportunity then for folks to provide input. It may be that we'll see what Chair Mitchell ends up putting in an agenda in a future meeting of this task force. But this is a potential bill idea that we potentially can discuss in future. We want to raise this idea for folks' consideration. So Senator Champion was first in line. So Senator Champion, we'll get back to your questions.
Simple question. Can you tell me if we were to explore the idea, or if we were to have a state-administered system, or hybrid, let me just say that, and you want to explore that possibility, a part of that exploration, will that include thinking about how tribes are dealt with because of ICWA? I mean, because the first thing that comes to my mind is, how do you deal with ICWA? Because we have the whole ICWA notion that usually when a case comes and there's some native blood, that it goes off to the tribe. So do you have any input as to how that has been traditionally dealt with, or are you suggesting that this is something we would have to explore if we are to go that direction?
Representative Hicks, I'm not sure who's going to take that, but
I can start and then we'll go to the expert.
We'll have you start.
That's why I said the first step
is to take a deep dive and have those conversations with our county agencies and our tribes. And that will include part of those ICWA conversations. I think the danger in making a huge system shift, whether it be, to a hybrid model from what is our current model, is that if you do so without all of the information, you're going to have hiccups, right? We've learned that with other processes, like Senator Hoffman talked about the MARC. We had hiccups. They weren't small hiccups. And so I think that's part of this first step, is having those conversations, talking about how does a central intake interact with ICWA. The other piece of that is that when we're talking about intake, we're talking about the very first step, right? We're not talking about anything that comes after. We're talking about there's a concern, a call has been made, what are we doing with that? So that's kind of this, and this step isn't even there. This is the step of what could that look like? What have we learned from other states? What have other states learned on their journey? And what have we learned from, like Senator Hoffman mentioned, what have we learned from the MARC? What have we learned from the research that's been done in the community? And taking all of those fragmented pieces of information and really putting them together to come up with a summary so we can make informed choices moving forward.
Dr. Laliberty, do you want to, and actually, sorry, before you do, I just want to say for those who are maybe not as familiar, MARC, Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center on the statewide hotline. I think it's come up somewhat, but for some of us who are newer to all these issues. So, but Dr. Laliberty, you can provide a comment, then we'll go back to Senator Champion.
Thank you, Chair. Really fabulous question that you're asking. And I think I agree with Representative Hicks. That's part of the study. That's part of really understanding it. But one of the most salient issues that we have to be very attentive to and take lead from our tribal partners is around data. Right now when a call comes in, whether it's Hennepin County or Yellow Medicine or Olmsted, that information is coming in, and it may be about a child where ICWA applies or a Native family. That's in the system. The centralized intake would be no different. It would be the same in terms of mandated reporters are calling in. But I do think it affords, having a tribal partner as part of a study group really looking at this really affords tribes a greater opportunity to be able to say, hey, there's data there that's about, our members or our citizens rather, and these are some of the things that are important to us in ways that we want that managed. So I think that in some ways it opens it up for some opportunity in that way. But you're asking all the right questions for sure.
Senator Champion, yep, of course.
Last question.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we have a fair amount of time built in. Yep.
So operationally, if there's a centralized space where someone could call in to report, then who would do the investigation?
Dr. Laliberty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it depends on how you construct it. The models that are out there, many of the models that are out there is that the intake comes in, the screening is done, the determination of track and assignment to the county is done at the centralized intake, and that the investigation or the family assessment is conducted at the county. Everything from there forward goes to the county. This is really about ensuring consistency and equity in terms of the screening and intake process. Now, I'm sure that there's many configurations of what that looks like and how that goes, and that's really part of what the study would have to reveal to us. And then, again, look at that to say, do we need that? Does that work for us? Are we already doing enough with that? I just think that that's what the process is about.
Can I ask Dr. Laliberty just to step, this may be helpful. As I'm looking at the report from 2015, that talked about having a hotline that would route calls to the appropriate local agency. So it actually sounds like they were contemplating at that point just at the very front end. So, but Senator Hoffman looks like maybe, if it's okay with Senator Champion, have Senator Hoffman hop in. Senator Hoffman.
It's in it, Mr. Chair, it's in addition to this conversation, as you're looking at that, it's like, where do I go? It's kind of like the early childhood debate since 1986, when Part H became Part C, it was the state was put a statewide system. Well, everybody got trenched in on what that means. Let me give you an example here. A county, I'm not going to say their name, So how do you report child abuse versus child protection reporting online forms, right? In this one county, anybody suspecting, call the social services intake line. Okay, that makes sense. If there's an emergency, then call 911. The next county from this county, not available, not available. So that information, so I don't know where to go. Then the next county down there, well, call this number and ask to speak to an intake worker. Right? I mean, there's just this lack of centralized information that gets us to saying, okay, now I'm trying to find something. I mean, if I want to go shopping for a box of Kleenexes, I can go on, not to mention, Amazon, right? And I can type in Kleenex, it'll give me all sorts of observations, right? If you have a centralized process just for the intake assessment to clear out some of this misinformation that's here, and I will share with you this whole piece, Kim, because when you look at it, you just say to yourself, okay, now I understand why we have such a system issue, because we don't have a system, right? And that's, I think, what you're trying to get to, and it would be really great to be able to Senator Champion's point that he was saying, Mr. Chair, as we're looking at this, how is that integrated so the whole system is connected, including the ICWA stuff? And that's, I see what you're shaking your head there, Kim, Ms. Legislator.
I know, well, Senator Champion was originally asking, though I feel like since Representative Hicks was invoked, you can, you want to make a... You were, that's a bunch. If it's okay for Senator Champion, I'll see Representative Hicks, was there something you want to say about this?
Yeah, I think we have to be really cautious when we're saying we want to do a study and we want to take a summary and we want to take a look. We have to be really cautious to not go in with what we think it's going to look like. I'm working really hard, which is hard for me because I have visions in my head, right? To really try to go in with an open mind, because I don't, as was shared, there isn't research that says do this thing. And so where we may end up may be exactly what the recommendation was, or it may look slightly different. But I think what we have to start with is what information do we need to make those decisions, and then getting that information. So that's my plan for this session, is to really focus on that very first step of, like Senator Hoffman has shared, there isn't a clear path. What information do we have? And what would be the right path for Minnesota? And come up with a plan for that moving forward. And I'm trying really, really hard to go into that with an open mind and hearing from all of our partners and all of the people involved in this system. Because, again, if there was a perfect way to do this, all 50 states would already be doing it.
As I send it back to Senator Champion, I'll note too, the recommendation at the time, even then, was to examine the possible development, right? So even then, pretty tentative, we need to think it through. So, but Senator Champion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that information. This is a beneficial conversation. What causes me a little trepidation is this, and I know that this is early in the process, is even those places or spaces or counties who do have a process where folks do know where to call and to report something. There's some inequities and some challenges in the process. And if we're only going to look at whether it should be centralized enough for someone to call and have a hotline, then I think we're doing the rest of the process an injustice, because the whole problem is there are some challenges within the system that is disproportionately affecting or impacting certain communities. And if we're really going to look at it, then we have to look at it thoroughly and fairly, and really think about it holistically. So I don't think that, no one has to sort of react to that. I'm just putting out there my concerns, because I just think that, once it gets in, there's the family assessment, there's a challenge, who's investigating it, who makes the decision. If it just keeps going down the family assessment route versus a child protection case being filed, then a whole question around notice and children and out-of-home placements, if that's going to happen, if there's an EPC, which is the emergency placement deal, right? Then where do the kids go, right? Then there's a system where, African-American homes are not thoroughly considered, because sometimes there are requirements and criteria that's there that sort of takes them out of the process, right? And leads to more permanency when it comes to a kid not being there. So I just wanted to put that out there because I just see us going down this route of saying clearing house and we know exactly where to go, that we're not really dealing with it holistically. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Senator Champion. And I should probably say, I don't envision this as this is a both and situation, right? Or a both and. Both and, yeah, absolutely. So, Senator, Representative Hicks, did you have something you want to say regarding any of that?
No, I just really appreciate that lens because I think it is, I mean, the data shows that there are inequities across the whole start to finish of this process. And as Senator Hoffman has pointed out in other hearings too, when we look at kids with disabilities, you know, and Tracy, correct me if I have the stat wrong, but it's like 50% of kids in the system have a disability. Is that correct? Something like that? It's very high.
Over 53% of kids in placement.
Yeah, over 53% of kids in placement have a disability. And so there's a variety of communities that are struggling at all stage of this process. And so I just really appreciate all the varied lenses that exist on this task force, and everybody's brings something different to the table and a different lens to the table, from Greater Minnesota, from a parental lens, from a disability advocacy lens, from an equity lens, from all the different lenses that everyone brings. I believe if we start somewhere, we can really move the needle forward in Minnesota, and I'm excited to see what comes of those discussions.
Thank you. Yeah, and can continue being in discussion with us, as I know you will be, and folks should contact you as well. I actually have a question that goes back, I'm now realizing, back on the prior topic, topic number 3. And by the way, seeing if there's any other questions regarding this issue of this statewide proposal at all. Not seeing any hands online. And no need to get up, Representative Hicks, but this is going to be for Dr. Laliberty. I was so focused on other folks' questions, I didn't think of my own, which was when we're thinking about county versus state systems nationwide, we're talking about administration of child welfare services, but there's a question about broader social services. I feel like one thing I've heard from folks saying, well, wait a second, if we have county administered child welfare along with other social services, and then the state administers county child welfare services, what about those other social services? So I'm just wondering, across the country, when you were looking at these different states, to what extent are child welfare services being delivered the same way as social services, other social services, if you understand my question?
I do, Mr. Chair. So there are examples. I don't think that it's a majority or preponderance of the states where they're like in the hybrid, for instance, in Nevada. Social services are still delivered broadly through the counties, and in some areas, the state has taken and just chunked the child welfare portion out. In Milwaukee or in Wisconsin, the counties are doing child welfare and the rest of their social services, but in Milwaukee continues to do their broader-based social services, but child protection has been taken out. So there's some examples of how that one service is either kind of collaboratively operated or solely out to the state, whereas the rest of the structure remains a county-based structure for other social services. And often it's connected, that's why I had those slides in there on the consent decrees and the settlement. It's often as a result of consent decree and settlement offers, litigation.
So I guess maybe just to clarify, so are there state-administered child welfare systems, not hybrid, it's all done by the state, but where other social services are actually at the county level? Or in those states, is it all social services are just done at the state level?
So that would really kind of be those 33 states that we looked at that really say that they're state-operated systems, but they're really functioning with this strong county autonomy under the umbrella of that state system. And again, there's 33 of those. Now, all of those would be along a continuum of variability. Maryland is a good example of that. They're a state system, but are they? Not really, because it really is operating at the county level. And Don, I don't know if you're still on the call, you may have other examples.
Mr. Winstead, any comments on that if you are on?
Yes, and as Tracy said, it varies a lot. There are a number of state-operated, state-administered systems where you would find the state administration is for most of the programs, but not necessarily all. So the ones that you would find mostly consistent with how the child welfare is done would be your public welfare systems, that is your eligibility and administration of your TANF cash assistance and SNAP food assistance program, et cetera, tend to be more alike. But as Tracy said, for example, in Maryland's a good example where the child welfare director is a state employee, but that state employee child welfare director gets essentially as a consensus hire with the county and sits with the county directors as part of that county team. In some places, like you get more centralization in SNAP and TANF, but it tends to be similar. Some places you would find a lot of the same dynamics you would see in a county system, except you would have, in some cases, multiple counties in a regional setup would be more typical. There was mention of Nevada. And in Nevada, in that hybrid system, if you go to Clark County, which is Las Vegas, or Washoe County, which is the Reno area, there it would be totally county administered, all the social services. But the other region that they call the rural region, there's just not the mass of people to justify the administrative infrastructure for delivery of social services. So there it tends to be more directly from the state. But you get just a variety of gradations of that from state to state.
Thank you very much. So even more complicated than might have initially thought. Thank you so much to both of you. And then any further questions at all anybody has before we let Dr. Laliberty go? Really appreciate all of your work in general, and then certainly today. And Representative Hicks, thanks for being here as well. So with that, okay, we're going to move to our final agenda item then, which is number 4 on the agenda. And we'll ask Mr. Kirchner to come on up. I'll be turning to Chair Mitchell as kind of taking the lead on this. I will note for folks that there's a page from the Office of Legislative Auditor report that's included in the packet. Last meeting, we received physical copies of that OLA report, and they're in all the packets. Same folder. Oh, they're still in there. Okay, excellent. Same folders. But we also have an extra copy, I think, of the page, Training on Child Removals, pages 37 and 38. So please identify yourself and proceed with your testimony and presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is David Kirchner. I was the project manager for our look at child protection removals and reunifications, which came out in 2022. And the chairs have asked me to come forward. I gave a presentation, as you all remember last time, but asked me to come forward and just provide a little bit of extra reiteration for our recommendations related to the training of law enforcement. So I have basically 4 points that I'm going to kind of walk through here. First of all, I want to note that we give law enforcement officers very important powers here. So in Minnesota, only law enforcement or the courts can remove a child from the home. In Minnesota, child protection agencies do not have that power. So the only way in which a child is removed without their parents' consent is either by a court order or by a law enforcement emergency hold. So that's an extremely important power and an extremely intrusive power that law enforcement has to go in and remove a child from the home. So that's item 1. Item 2, our report found that there was a lot of variation in how that power is used around the state. We saw that in some counties, nearly all child removals are initiated through a law enforcement emergency hold. That is kind of the typical process which they go through. Whether or not law enforcement is on the scene and makes a sudden decision, or whether or not you have a child protection agency that feels that a removal needs to occur and goes to law enforcement and asks them to proceed with that removal, it's through law enforcement. On the other hand, and there are other counties, and quite a few, where that is not typically the case, where in fact the process is that law enforcement only removes a child in those emergency circumstances, but in other circumstances where the Child Protection Agency wants a child to be removed from the home, they go to the court and they get a court order instead, and so they don't involve law enforcement. So you have variation in how that is done. You also have variation within the county level. We asked child protection agencies in a survey that we did, given similar circumstances, would the different law enforcement agencies within your county react the same way? And about half of them said, no, we think there would be differences, that given the same circumstances, some law enforcement agencies would respond somewhat differently than others would, just because they're different agencies and they have different practices. And lastly, I'll note that we had variation in terms of what happened after those law enforcement removals occurred. In some counties, practically all of those law enforcement removals led to a longer court-ordered out-of-home placement. Whereas in other counties, there was a very significant number, as many as 1/4 or even 1/3 of the children that were removed through a law enforcement hold were returned to the families within that 72-hour period, either before or at the time that you got to a court hearing. So real differences in terms of those outcomes that happened after those law enforcement holds. Third point I wanted to talk about is that we have all this variation, but we have very limited oversight and limited guidance for law enforcement officers about how they're supposed to use this important power. Neither the courts nor anybody else really evaluate whether law enforcement agencies have appropriately acted when they have removed children from the home, or perhaps when they had an opportunity to but chose not to remove children from the home. There's not really an evaluation process that we have out there from the courts or from anybody else. And in fact, we have a lack of data in terms of even how often this power is being used. We found that we were able to say something about, for example, how many removals there were by law enforcement agencies within, for example, Hennepin County. But we can't tell you how many law enforcement removals were done by City of Minneapolis Police versus City of Brooklyn Center versus City of Bloomington versus Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, because nobody collects that information. And that's true statewide. We cannot tell you how often this power is being used. There are, in addition to that lack of information, there's no requirements for ongoing training for law enforcement officers on how to use this power. All law enforcement officers get some training at the academy level about child protection, about their responsibilities, but after that point in time, there's no requirement. We asked agencies law enforcement agencies around the state, whether or not they required their officers to have ongoing training. Only 15% that they said that they did require ongoing training with regard to law enforcement removals. That isn't to say that there isn't training. Sometimes there's training that happens, but it's not required as a standard part of their ongoing training procedures. And I will also note that law enforcement agencies generally express to us an interest in finding opportunities to do training on child protection and on removals. So it wasn't for necessarily lack of interest. It was just not a requirement that they had. So the fourth point I want to get to is just simply to repeat the recommendations that I shared with you the last time around, that we suggested that first of all, that there be that somebody, and we think it makes the most sense to be DHS, collect information on which law enforcement agencies actually remove children, because we think that information should be something that can be looked at and can be studied. And second of all, we recommended that DHS work with the Post Board and with other entities to form a working group to make recommendations to the legislature about training for law enforcement. We thought it was concerning, frankly, that you have this tremendous power that is given to law enforcement officers to make that decision whether or not to remove children from the home, and we don't have ongoing training for them. And you may have law enforcement officers who've been on the job 20 years who are then, are put into a situation where they're faced with having to make a decision, and they're having to go back to the training that they got 15, 20 years ago in academy. We thought that we can do better, and we encouraged DHS and others to make recommendations to you. And so that is kind of a summary of what we said with regard to law enforcement training in our recommendations last time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm going to call on Chair Mitchell if she wishes to make some comments about this as well.
Thank you so much for being here and expounding on this issue. this was my request because I want to work on that mandated training piece, not just for law enforcement, but I think our like kind of first line people like educators, pediatricians, people that are seeing children a lot. That's our very first point of success or failure when we're, advocating for children and making sure that they either get the resources they need or we make sure that they're safe. So thank you so much for being here, as I said. I have talked to, just to add to what was said, I have talked to some of the organizations because I'm working as part of that on the law enforcement piece. It does sound like, talking to the post board, that there would be room to add some training into what they already have, and what that would look like. And I don't know that you can answer my question, but some of the things I have read, the training talks more about holds and more about like the physical part of the removal, but I haven't seen a lot in terms of actual mindfully being able to assess a situation and what the child needs, whether it's something based on resources or whether it's actual physical, sexual abuse, things like that. Was there any differentiation into what was described as to what type of training is most advised, or is a combination of everything?
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you very much, Senator Mitchell, for the question. And I think what our feeling is, and this is why we made the recommendation to DHS, is that we wanted the thinking about what sorts of training law enforcement should be getting to be led by people with expertise in child protection, not necessarily with expertise in law enforcement, because that's where that expertise, is going to lie in terms of thinking about things like appropriately assessing situations, in terms of thinking about issues related to systemic and historical bias issues, in terms of thinking about the variety of different circumstances that might be encountered and different ways in which responses could occur that are something other, for example, than removing a child from the home. So that was, because that was a question that actually DHS asked us. They said, that's interesting. Why are you making this recommendation to us? Why aren't you making this recommendation to the post board? Because they're the ones that you tend to think about in terms of, training for law enforcement officers. And as I said, our feeling was that we wanted just the types of things that you're talking about to be addressed. And so we thought having the conversation led by people who have the expertise in this policy area would then would make sure that those sorts of elements got into the conversation.
Chair Mitchell.
Thank you again. And then the other part of this is, from what I'm talking to people, and then it seems like you reiterated what I've found a little bit, is that there is some initial training as anyone going into law enforcement, if you go through that in Minnesota, would get, just so everyone knows, if you transfer from another state, you may or may not have that. But I also couldn't find consistency in, if you go through this program versus this program, anyone that could tell me how many hours, so it doesn't seem like there's a mandatory number of hours. And I kind of found the same information on that initial training in your schooling, is that it seems to be a little bit more based on like restraints and kind of dealing with children, and not the underlying issues of how we mindfully deal with children in crisis that might see this. This is kind of almost a yes or no question. I just want to make sure that what I have found so far in my research kind of matches, or if you had anything to add to that.
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you very much, Senator Mitchell. I think that is, it's been a couple years since, we did the interviews on this, so I'm reaching back in my memory, and I want to acknowledge that. But that sounds consistent with what we heard as well.
I'll maybe note, I'm just looking at the page from the OLA report, pages 37 to 38, that at least what you wrote in the report is it sounds like the training that somebody receives in Minnesota, if they're receiving their license and going through their initial training in Minnesota, is just training on child development issues to ensure officers respond appropriately to perceived child protection situations. So it's unclear whether that would even cover holds. It sounds like maybe that it's more reliant on field training after you're hired, but that only 2/3 of agencies said that there was any training on child protection holds, and with that being often less than almost all cases less than 2 hours. So yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. So Chair Mitchell, okay. Anything else that anybody has for Mr. Kirshner to ask? This has been, I think this and the prior presentation regarding the statewide maltreatment reporting system, both some nice previews and have folks be aware these are a couple of things we're looking at. So looking to see if any other questions. Nobody's raising hands online. So Mr. Kirshner, thank you so much. So I think we are good there. I'm going to turn to Chair Mitchell to see if there's anything she wishes to say at this point, whether about a next meeting or about anything else that she wishes to say. Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. So we will be having our next task force meeting the week prior to legislative session starting. That would be the week of the 5th, I believe, February 5th. Everyone should have a poll, so if you can answer that, I would like to get the date nailed down soon. One of the thoughts for that is that several of us are working on different child protection topics. And so if anyone wanted to come forward with a piece that they're working on and either have someone kind of testify as a preview or throw out ideas to the group before we actually get into session, that we would be willing to hear from either members here or members of the community of like specific legislation, because I said this in the last meeting, but my goal out of this is not to like rush and throw a bunch of things we haven't even thought about out there. But if we have things that are mindful, the goal is to actually start improving pieces of the system for our children. So again, I've already had people bring to me a couple really great ideas that they're going to be working on this legislative session. So that would be one of the goals of that next session. Thank you.
And Madam Chair,
Yes, I'm sorry.
And Senator Champion.
if you'd be so kind also to look at the Minnesota African American Family Preservation Act, that's something that's been worked on for quite some time, so it'd be great for the committee to take a look at that.
And I see Chair Mitchell making a note about that, Senator Champion. Thank you. Yeah, thank you much. And that was referenced obviously in testimony earlier too. So thank you very much. And I think that poll that was referenced, I think it had not been sent out to House members yet, but it's going to be. So for my fellow House members, so we'll get that back. That may have been a little bit of a mix-up there. But so good to know. So that week before the legislative session starts, it sounds like is the plan for that next meeting. Looking to see if there's anything else from task force members. I will again encourage members of the public to be reaching out to us and task force members as well to do all that we can together to improve safety and the ability to thrive for all kids in Minnesota. So with that, our meeting is adjourned. Thanks so much, everybody.